most especially soybean farmers, the quote collateral damage, as Politico puts it, in the president's trade war with China. Since May, China has not purchased a single U.S. soybean, not a one, according to the American Soybean Association, turning instead to Brazil and Argentina. That last country there, one that the Trump administration decided to send a $25 million aid package, a bailout that could be backfiring, according to Agriculture Secretary.
Ever think when you voted for President Trump that things were going to cost you more and you were going to lose money?
I never thought I was going to lose this much money, this fast.
We have a lot of unhappy farmers in this country at the moment, and I'm sure the Prime Minister won't thank me for raising this. We've had changes to inheritance tax, which mean a lot of farmers feel they're going to lose their farms when they die or their father dies. How important are farmers to a country?
I love our farmers. As you know, in our tax bill, we have a clause that's very important. We were losing a lot of farms to the banks because a loving mother and father would die and left their farm to their children or their child, but their children, their family. But they had a 50% tax to pay. So the land would get valued and at a high number because some of the farms were valuable, but they didn't, they couldn't quantify it. And they'd go out and borrow money to pay the estate tax or the death tax, as it's called. And they'd overextend and they'd lose the farm. And they'd commit suicide in many cases.
We're seeing that.
Our levels are nowhere near 50%. They're not. We've just introduced where it's paid over many years, works out
well, that's good.
An extra 2% a year.
The rise of a new global partnership often begins in silence. No fanfare, no headlines, only quiet exchanges across conference tables and handshakes behind closed doors. That was how the farming alliance between Africa and Brazil was born, a whisper that grew into a tide that soon began to drown the proud boasts of American agriculture. For decades, the United States had styled itself as the breadbasket of the world, the unstoppable supplier of corn, soybeans, wheat, and meat. It had leaned on technology, subsidies, and massive industrial farms to dominate global markets. Yet as the African continent and Brazil found common cause, that dominance began to fracture, and what once seemed eternal now trembled like a stalk in the wind. The story was not just about farming. It was about identity, power, and the shifting gravity of the world economy. Africa had long been dismissed as a place of endless need, a continent reliant on aid and external instruction. Brazil, though blessed with vast farmlands, had been mocked as chaotic, too disorganized to challenge giants. But both carried within them immense potential, and when they joined hands, the potential became force. They built a partnership rooted not in old colonial patterns, but in shared experiences, in recognition of similar climates, soils, and histories of struggle. Together they forged a system that was both cooperative and competitive, one that soon began reshaping the very map of global food supply. The first signs were subtle. Shipments of African cocoa began to move through Brazilian ports, bypassing traditional Western brokers. Joint ventures planted soybeans in Angola and Mozambique with Brazilian expertise guiding the process. Brazilian machinery companies struck deals to build factories in Ghana and Nigeria, training local workers while expanding production capacity. Slowly but surely, African harvests gained new reach, not as raw exports sold cheaply, but as part of a powerful network that added value before the crops ever left port. American farmers hardly noticed at first. They were busy with their own concerns, wrestling with changing weather patterns, trade disputes, and shifting domestic policies. They assumed their role was secure, that the world would always look to the Midwest for grain and the South for cotton. They had faith in a system built on decades of dominance. But beneath that faith, the ground was already shifting. As the alliance deepened, African and Brazilian scientists began to collaborate on seed technology suited to tropical and semi-tropical climates, varieties resilient to drought, pests, and floods. Unlike American seeds engineered for temperate zones, these varieties thrived where U.S. crops struggled. Yields rose across Africa's savannas. And river valleys, fields that had once produced only subsistence harvests now generated surpluses. Brazil shared not only its technology but its hard-learned lessons in organizing smallholders into cooperatives, allowing scattered farmers to access global markets as a unified force. The old stereotype of fragmented African farming gave way to an emerging reality of coordination and strength. Markets began to respond. Importers in Asia, always hungry for cheaper and reliable supplies, turned increasingly toward the alliance. Shipments of soybeans that once flowed from American ports now carried African and Brazilian stamps. Coffee once dominated by American-linked brands was now roasted and branded under joint Africa-Brazil labels, promoted as authentic, ethical, and resilient. Even livestock production began to shift as Brazilian expertise in cattle ranching combined with African grazing lands to expand meat exports. The impact on the United States was gradual but undeniable. Prices slipped, export contracts shrank, storage bins filled with unsold grain. Farmers accustomed to stability felt the squeeze. They heard reports of African harvest festivals where yields had doubled, of Brazilian cargo ships unloading in markets once loyal to American suppliers, and they began to sense that the world was turning. Politicians tried to reassure them. They spoke of American innovation, of the resilience of its agricultural sector, of new deals on the horizon. But those words rang hollow against the reality of declining global share. The simple fact was that the alliance offered buyers not only cheaper prices but also the promise of growth. Africa held vast untapped farmland, much of it waiting for irrigation and infrastructure. Brazil had decades of experience converting raw and into farmland and exporting at scale. Together they were not just suppliers but pioneers of a new frontier, a frontier that made America look stagnant. The U.S. attempted countermeasures. Trade envoys were dispatched to negotiate deals. Subsidies were increased to support struggling farmers. Marketing campaigns tried to rebrand American produce as superior. Yet these efforts fell short. Buyers cared less about slogans and more about numbers, and the numbers favored the alliance. Shipping routes across the South Atlantic shortened delivery times to key markets. Joint investments in ports and railways improved efficiency, and the moral appeal of supporting African development added a layer of prestige to imports from the alliance that American goods could not match. Within a decade, the transformation became impossible to ignore. America's once unassailable dominance had fractured. The proud Midwest fields still produced, but they no longer dictated global terms. The balance of power in agriculture had shifted southward, toward the tropics, toward the lands once underestimated. And as the shift deepened, it brought consequences not only for farmers but for the entire geopolitical structure built upon food. For food is never just food. It is leverage, it is security, it is a foundation of influence. For years, the United States had wielded grain as a tool of diplomacy, offering aid or threatening embargoes, using agriculture as a quiet weapon in global politics. But as its grip weakened, so too did its ability to command. African and Brazilian leaders, once forced to bow before American trade envoys, now stood taller. They spoke, not as recipients but as partners, their voices carrying the authority of abundance. The transformation resonated deeply within Africa itself. Farmers who had long lived under the shadow of poverty found new dignity in their work. Communities that once depended on aid now earned through trade. Young people who once dreamed of leaving the land now saw futures in farming enriched by technology and global reach. Meanwhile, in Washington, the rhetoric turned sharper. Politicians accused the alliance of unfair practices, of manipulating markets, of undermining free trade. But these accusations fell flat, for the alliance had done nothing illegal or underhanded. It had simply cooperated, shared knowledge, and seized opportunities long ignored. The anger from America sounded less like righteous protest and more like the frustration of a power watching its grip slip away. The American public, far removed from the intricacies of global trade, felt the consequences in subtle ways. Grocery prices shifted, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, but always unpredictable. Food brands that once carried the label of American pride now faced competition from joint Africa-Brazil products marketed as fresher, fairer, and more sustainable. Even cultural pride began to wobble, as the idea of America as the world's breadbasket no longer held true. The media struggled to frame the story. Some outlets painted the alliance as a threat, warning of foreign dominance and the end of American prosperity. Others celebrated it as a necessary balance, a long overdue correction of global inequality. But regardless of spin, the reality remained. The farming alliance between Africa and Brazil was crushing American agriculture, not through malice or conspiracy, but through competence and cooperation. And so the tide continued to rise. Fields across Africa bloomed with crops once considered impossible. Brazilian ports pulsed with the rhythm of endless shipments. American silos groaned with unsold grain. And somewhere in the heartland, a farmer stood in his empty barn and wondered how it had all slipped away. The alliance between Africa and Brazil did not emerge in a vacuum. It rose from years of frustration, from decades of exploitation, and from centuries of watching others profit from the sweat of our farmers. Africa had the land, the people, and the potential. Brazil had the expertise, the machinery, and the experience. Together, they built a bridge across the Atlantic, a bridge not of colonial chains, but of brotherhood. That bridge has become the foundation of a new agricultural order, one that terrifies the United States. The truth is that America never expected this alliance. Washington believed Africa was too divided, too poor, too dependent to ever challenge its agricultural dominance. They believed Brazil, a former U.S. ally, would never turn its back on Western dictates. They underestimated the hunger for freedom, the drive for sovereignty, the unstoppable force of nations tired of being used. And now, America pays the price for that arrogance. What we see today is not only an economic shift but a cultural revolution. African farmers who once sold raw crops at humiliating prices are now part of a global supply chain that bypasses American corporations. Villages that once struggled to sell surplus maize now export directly to Asian markets. Families who once watched their children go hungry now see prosperity rising from their own soil. The dignity of farming has returned. Agriculture is no longer seen as a burden. It is seen as power, and let us not forget how this alliance has inspired a new wave of African innovation. Brazilian technology was shared, yes, but Africa did not simply copy. Africa adapted. Africa improved. Africa reimagined. Drone technology developed in Kenya monitors vast plantations in real time. Solar-powered irrigation systems in Nigeria ensure year-round farming. Vertical farming projects in South Africa transform cities into food-producing hubs. This is the Africa America never wanted to see. An Africa that is not just a supplier of raw materials, but a leader in global agricultural science. America's panic grows every day because its strategy of control is failing. For decades, the U.S. weaponized organizations like the IMF and World Bank to keep Africa underdeveloped, issuing loans tied to agricultural dependency. They forced African nations to import food instead of producing their own. They told farmers what to plant, when to plant, and how to plant. They made Africa the consumer, while America remained the producer. But today, those chains are broken. The alliance with Brazil has given Africa access to capital, equipment, and knowledge outside of U.S. control. The World Bank's grip is slipping. The IMF's threats no longer terrify. America has lost its ability to dictate Africa's food future. The ripple effects are enormous. Look at Asia. Nations like China, India, and Indonesia, once dependent on American soybeans and grains, are now importing directly from Africa and Brazil. This shift has cost American farmers billions. Look at the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which relied on American wheat, are now signing exclusive contracts with African Brazilian suppliers. America has been pushed out of markets it once considered untouchable. Look even at Latin America. Once America's backyard, it now embraces Africa as a partner, seeing the alliance as proof that the global South can prosper without Washington's chains. The United States knows it is losing. That is why we see desperation, trade wars, sanctions, tariffs, propaganda. They call African products unsafe. They accuse Brazil of corruption. They attack this alliance in the media. They try to paint Africa as unstable and Brazil as unreliable. But the world is no longer listening. Because the world sees results. They see ships leaving African ports loaded with grain, soy, and rice. They see markets stabilizing. They see prices dropping for consumers. They see a system that works, a system America cannot destroy. What makes this alliance unbreakable is not only its economic strength, but its moral foundation. Africa and Brazil know what it means to suffer under exploitation. They know what it means to be enslaved, colonized, and silenced. They know what it means to rise from chains and still stand tall. That shared history is what gives this alliance its resilience. It is not built on profit alone. It is built on memory, on dignity, on the refusal to ever again bow to empires. And so the alliance deepens. It is no longer just about food. It is about education, with African students studying agricultural science in Brazil and Brazilian experts training in Africa. It is about technology, with joint research centers developing climate-resilient seeds that will transform farming in both regions. It is about infrastructure, with Brazilian engineering firms building roads, ports, and storage facilities across Africa, linking rural farmers to global markets. Sanctions cannot stop the rain from falling or the soil from producing. Sanctions cannot stop unity. America's tools of intimidation have lost their power. Do you see the irony? For centuries, America told the world that capitalism meant competition, that free markets meant opportunity. But now, when Africa and Brazil compete fairly, when they offer the world cheaper, better food, America cries foul. They wanted free trade only when they controlled it. Now that the control is gone, they expose themselves as hypocrites, and as America declines, so too does its global image. Farmers in the U.S. protest in the streets. States that once thrived on agricultural exports face bankruptcy. Small towns that depended on farming income now wither away. Politicians argue, but they cannot fix the problem, because the problem is not policy, the problem is power. America no longer has it. This is the lesson the world must learn. Power is not permanent. Empires rise and fall. And today, America's agricultural empire is falling, brought down not by bombs, not by armies, but by the simple unity of Africa and Brazil. A unity born from soil, watered by sweat, and harvested by dignity. Imagine what comes next. Imagine Africa and Brazil creating their own global food exchange, setting prices without Wall Street. Imagine an African-Brazilian agricultural bank funding farmers without IMF conditions. Imagine research hubs across both continents developing organic solutions that end the need for American pesticides and fertilizers. Imagine the world no longer forced to depend on U.S. exports, but instead looking to Africa and Brazil for food security. That future is not fantasy. It is already happening. America is terrified because it knows that once the global South proves it can survive without the North, the entire world order collapses. If Africa and Brazil can feed the world, then why should Asia, the Middle East, or Latin America listen to Washington's threats? If the global South controls food, then the West controls nothing. And so the harvest continues. Ships leave African ports filled with grain and soy. Brazilian cargo joins them. Together they flood markets that once depended on American exports. The U.S. dollar weakens. Farmers in America abandon their fields. Politicians in Washington panic. The empire shakes all because Africa and Brazil decided enough was enough. This is where we stand today at the dawn of a new agricultural age. An age where food is no longer a weapon of the West, but a tool of liberation for the South. An age where Africa and Brazil stand as equals, as partners. As leaders, an age where the soil speaks louder than Washington's threats. Let the world hear this truth. Africa and Brazil have crushed U.S. agriculture not out of hatred, but out of necessity. They have built this alliance not to destroy, but to survive. And in surviving, they have thrived. In thriving, they have rewritten history. And in rewriting history, they have shown us all that the power of unity is greater than the power of empire. So let America watch its fields grow silent, its silos overflow with unsold grain, its farmers protest in despair. Let them witness what happens when arrogance meets resistance, when monopoly meets unity, when empire meets justice. Let them learn, as all fallen powers must learn, that the soil always remembers, and the harvest always comes.